Nina, though she was a quiet and homely girl, had never been neglected by her admirers. Ever since high school, they did not give her a pass, thinking that such a beautiful girl would do anything for money and gifts. But she was a smart girl. She got straight A's, and she graduated from high school with honor. Nina disliked parties, considering them a waste of time, but that night she still gave in to persuasion of her college classmates and went with them to the club. Nina sat alone at a table and was bored. The table was behind a big pillar, so the pounding music wasn't very audible. Moreover, she was not so much noticeable in the darkness, so there were not many guys who would like to entertain a beautiful girl. Nina had long ago developed a mechanism for scaring them away. When the next guy who wanted to get to know her appeared, she silently stared into his eyes, trying to make her gaze as crazy as possible, and it worked without fail. So she was sitting there sipping a soda, periodically rejecting the next macho, and scrolling in her head the plot of a recent book, until her piece was interrupted by Clark. He watched the girl from the sidelines and figured out her method in about 5 minutes. He sat across from her in silence, and when Nina made her usual grimace, he made a similar one, and the staring game began. Nina surrendered first. She could not hold back and burst out laughing, while Clark was sitting and admiring the laughing girl. Nina immediately liked Clark. He was able to figure her out and analyze. It means he was smart. Besides, Nina did not like too good-looking men. There was no masculinity in them, and only lust was in their eyes. Clark was thin, but she was sure that physically he was much stronger than all those pumped-up playboys. Nina looked seriously into the stranger's eyes and held out her hand to introduce herself. The man squeezed her hand slightly, as if he was afraid of hurting it, and asked why she was sitting alone. "First of all, my friends are all on the dancing floor, and secondly, I hope I'm not alone anymore," the girl replied with a smile. "By the way, I was just about to leave. Could you please walk me out? I live down the block." Clark nodded, and they walked out of the club together. As they walked, the man didn't say a single ambiguous word. There wasn't even a supposedly casual touch, but the maximum of courtesy. On the walking, it turned out that Clark was also a fourth-year student, but at a different college. After seeing the girl to the doorway, he took Nina's phone number, and they said goodbye. They got married right after graduation from college. Clark's father got him a job in his company at a fairly good salary, and Nina got a job at a government-owned company where, of course, the salary was lower, but it was partially compensated by benefits. Having gotten firmly on their feet and no longer worrying about whether they would have food in the fridge tomorrow, the young family decided to purchase their own apartment. At first, they wanted a mortgage, but Clark's father offered to pay the full price for them and give it to them in installments. And they would not have to pay interest to the bank, and there would be no penalties in case they were unable to make a monthly payment. Clark and Nina agreed, and they moved into a new apartment in a decent part of the city. Soon, Nina became pregnant, and they had a healthy and strong baby boy. The young parents were over the moon, and it seemed to everyone that everything would always be only good, or better than it was before. After the baby was born, Nina began to devote most of her time to the baby, and it was quite natural, but not for Clark. To Nina's great astonishment, Clark began to reproach her for the lack of attention. He was pestering her with conversations when the young mother was trying to soothe the crying baby who had a tummy ache or fever. Clark was outraged and angry if at these moments Nina did not listen to him, taking care of the baby. In addition, quarrels about everyday life began. Clark thought that his wife was idle at home while he was at work, and that she should find time to cook for her beloved husband a meal. clean the apartment perfectly and so on. Clark himself, being there on weekends, rested all day in front of the TV or on the computer, reasoning that he was tired for the week and he needed a rest because he was earning their living, and in general the child was a woman's business and there was no need to bring him into it. Clark did not realize how many new worries had appeared in his wife's life. Nina tried to please her husband and gave him all the spare time that was not occupied by their son, and at the same time she managed to look as good as the day they met. Only the circles under her eyes revealed her constant lack of sleep and fatigue. But for her husband, it was still not enough. After a couple of months, Clark started coming back from work much later, explaining it by the increased responsibility and commitment he had been promoted. And then, several times, he came only on Saturday mornings, explaining it all the same way, a lot of work which required him to stay overnight to get everything done and not leave it for the next week. One day Clark got very sick, and Nina and the baby had to move in with her mother for a while so that they wouldn't get infected. After a few days, Nina decided to stop by home to pick up some of the baby's things. She did not warn Clark because she knew he had an appointment with the doctor at that time. But she was surprised when she heard a woman's laughing and her husband's voice coming from the bedroom. She tiptoed in and cautiously peeked inside. Her supposedly sick husband was lying on their marital bed with another woman. "Are you feeling better yet?" asked Nina with a venomous smile. It was just like in the movies. 2 seconds of stupor, and then the fuss began. The woman tried to hide and get dressed at the same time, periodically asking for an apology. Clark, on the other hand, just sat silently on the bed, wrapping his arms around his head. After his mistress left, he began to make excuses. "What did you think? I'm a man, I have needs. I need a woman when I want her, not a couple of times a week when she is half asleep. It used to be okay until the child appeared. If I had known what would happen, I wouldn't have agreed to have him. All these diapers are everywhere. I can't sleep because of his crying at night, but I have to work. Clark, be quiet. The baby is sleeping. Clark, don't make a sound. You'll wake up the baby. I'm sick of it. I love you, honestly, very much, but somehow it's all difficult for me." Nina was standing, unable to understand where her Clark had gone. That kind, cheerful and affectionate man she had fallen madly in love with. She could not believe that she heard from him these words of a hardened egoist, because before he tried to please her in everything. She even washed the dishes very rarely. Is it possible that the birth of their son had changed her husband? Nina didn't know the answers, but Clark's action was the last straw. "I'll drop by tomorrow, pick up my and the baby's things. I'll stay at my mum's. And I'm filing for divorce. Between you and the baby, I'll always choose my son." "Divorce?" laughed Clark. "Who wants you with a baby and a penny salary and living at your mother's? Keep looking for a fool. You'll get nothing from me. The apartment is in my father's name. You'll receive alimony from the minimum wage. You know that my salary is low on papers." Nina no longer listened. It seemed that the world around had risen upside down, and the man she loved an hour ago said something that even an enemy would not say. She turned around and left the apartment. When she got home, Nina went into her room and lay down on her bed. The baby was asleep, and so as not to wake the boy, Nina sobbed silently from the flood of emotions and awareness of everything that had happened. The next day she went to get her things, but there was already suitcases on the stairwell. Nina wanted to ring the doorbell, But at the last moment, she changed her mind. She didn't want to go into this apartment that had been their family nest. I hope he collected all the baby's things, she thought, and hearing a rustling outside the door, the woman grinned sadly. Then she took her bags and went down to the cab waiting for her. The divorce process was hard. As Clark had threatened, Nina received nothing but a penny alimony. Clark's father could not openly go against his son, even though it was obvious that they were on the brink of strife. He offered to help Nina because the baby was his grandson, but she refused. The money Nina earned was not enough for everything she wished for her baby. So soon, she decided to quit her job and open her own business. Because of the valuable experience gained at work in a state company, her brains, and of course the help of her mother, who seemed to have found her second youth, taking care of her grandson, Nina was able to grow her business. She delved into work, so a year later, if she remembered Clark, it was only with a slight sadness, because they had so many happy moments together in the past. 5 years later, Nina was sitting on the terrace of her own house, watching her son, playing with a dog on the lawn. Suddenly the phone vibrated. The security guards of the neighborhood, where the house was located, called. "Mrs. Bell, there's a man here. He says he knows you. His name's Clark." From the excitement, Nina barely understood what he said. She had not heard anything about Clark since the divorce. He did not get in touch with her, although she tried to call him a couple of times. The rascal took her family tea set away, which had been passed down in their family for 4 generations. "Let him in," was all she could manage to utter. "All right, Mrs. Bell, I'll send Tom with him, just in case." Her house was not far from the entrance to the neighborhood, and it didn't take long to wait. Nina was on the terrace, and she was so tense that she sat in an armchair, gripping tightly to the armrests. After all, he had been the dearest person to her once. Seeing the visitor, Nina at first thought it was a joke. The man looked about 40 years old. His hair was dominated by grey hair, his gait was unsteady, and his eyes were running as if searching for something. Stopping his gaze on Nina, he smiled broadly and immediately began to quickly and confusedly tell Nina his story. It turns out that soon after the divorce, his father could not calm down and forgive his son because he loved Nina as a daughter and doted on his grandson. So he kicked Clark out of the apartment, which belonged to him. Giving him money for the first time, he ordered him to get out of town. So strong was his resentment. He could not even look into Nina's eyes, so ashamed he was for his son. Clark had been surviving on odd jobs. He lacked real experience. He had many indulgences in his father's company. One day, he read about Nina in the newspaper. She donated a large sum to a charity. It was then that Clark decided to go to her, to try to establish relations with her. Having said all this, he stood looking at her, smiling. Nina was in a stupor for 10 seconds, digesting what she had heard, and then laughed. Guard Tom never, as long as Nina remembered, showed any emotion, a true professional. But now, even on his lips, flashed a smile imperceptibly and immediately disappeared. "Who needs you?" said Nina seriously. "What did you once advise me to do? Look for a fool." The dumbfounded Clark was silently escorted out the gate, and Nina was looking at her son, and there were tears in her eyes. It would have been so wonderful to sit here with the previous Clark and watch their son grow up, who looked exactly like her ex-husband.